The mission was supposed to be simple. Get in, confirm the target, get out. That's what they always said, and that's what Lieutenant Marcus Halle had believed every single time. He laced up his boots and kissed the photograph of his daughter before stepping into the dark. But war has never cared much for simple plans, and that night in the Kunar province of Afghanistan, the mountains themselves seemed to conspire against them. There were 6 of them. SEAL Team 4, the best trained fighters America had ever produced. They moved like shadows through the narrow ravine, their night vision cutting green tunnels through the blackness. Marcus led from the front, the way he always had, the way his father taught him a real man leads. Not from behind, but into the fire first. The intelligence had placed the target in a compound 2 clicks. North, clean, quiet, routine. But as they rounded the bend of the ravine, the world exploded. If you've ever heard a firefight erupt from total silence, you know it doesn't sound like the movies. It sounds like the sky breaking. Suddenly, the ridge above them lit up with muzzle flashes, dozens of them, pouring down from both sides. RPGs screamed overhead. Petty Officer Danny Reeves went down in the first 30 seconds, not dead, but hit, dragging himself behind a boulder while shouting his own coordinates into the radio. Marcus counted the flashes above, 15, maybe 20 enemy fighters, perfectly positioned. They had been waiting. Someone had talked. The SEALs were cornered, outgunned, and running low on cover options inside a canyon that was starting to feel less like a ravine and more like a grave. Marcus pressed his back against the rock, breathing slowly the way he'd trained himself to breathe. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. Around him, his brothers were returning fire with everything they had, but the math was brutal. They couldn't climb out. They couldn't push forward. And retreating meant crossing open ground under direct fire. He got on the radio and called it in, troops in contact, heavy fire, requesting immediate air support, but the response crackled back cold. Weather systems were closing in. Air support was 22 minutes out. He looked at Danny, whose face was pale and whose hands were pressed against his own side. And he knew 22 minutes was a sentence, not a rescue time. What happened next is the part Marcus still can't fully explain, not in after-action reports, not in therapy, not to his daughter when she's old enough to ask. The firefight had been raging for nearly 6 minutes. An eternity in combat, when a single crack rang out from the southern ridge, distinct from all the chaos, slower, deliberate, powerful. One of the enemy fighters on the eastern wall dropped. Then another crack, another body. The firing from the ridge began to shift, to hesitate, like a wave that suddenly realizes there's a wall in front of it. Someone was shooting from the south? But there was no one assigned to the south. The SEALs had no support element on that ridge. Marcus's radio stayed silent, no call sign, no unit, no voice. The shooting was precise in a way that felt almost supernatural. Whoever was behind that rifle was working at range, in the dark, alone, and hitting moving targets on a slope with a crosswind blowing down from the Hindu Kush. One shot at a time, methodical, patient, the way a man shoots when he has nothing to prove and everything to protect. The enemy fire began to fracture. Fighters who had been screaming and surging started pulling back, confused, believing they had somehow been flanked by a larger force. In the chaos of that confusion, Marcus pulled Danny to his feet, grabbed his team, and they moved hard and fast through the ravine and out the southern mouth of the canyon, carrying their wounded brother into the cold air on the other side. They never found the shooter. Drone footage reviewed the next morning showed a single set of boot prints on the southern ridge, leading up from a goat trail that wound down to a small village 3 kilometers away. The prints led to a firing position behind a flat rock, and then they simply stopped, as though the man had dissolved into the mountain itself. The village elders, when pressed through an interpreter, would say nothing. But an old woman in the market, the kind of woman who has watched wars come and go like seasons, looked at Marcus when he described what happened, and she said something in Pashto that the interpreter hesitated before translating. She said, "There are men in these mountains who lost everything to this war. Some of them chose hate. One of them chose something else." Marcus Halle returned home 63 days later. He walked through the airport in civilian clothes, anonymous, carrying his bag past families and travelers who had no idea what he carried inside him. His daughter ran to him at the gate, 7 years old, pigtails flying, and when she hit his chest and wrapped her small arms around him, he held her so tightly that she laughed and said, "Daddy, I can't breathe." And he loosened his grip and pressed his face into her hair and whispered, "I know, baby. I know." He thought about the man on the ridge. He thought about what it costs a person to save a stranger. He thought about how the greatest acts of courage in this world are almost never witnessed, never recorded, never rewarded. They happen in the dark, on cold mountains, by people whose names we will never know. If this story moved something inside you, then you already understand why these stories need to be told. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that quiet courage still exists in this world. And if you've made it this far, thank you for listening. Stories like this one survive only because people like you refuse to let them disappear.